Hey guys, in this video I'm going to be discussing the principle of linear progression. Linear progression basically means adding further resistance and further difficulty to exercise in order to increase the adaptation. This principle of increased resistance can be traced right back to the ancient Greeks and the myth of Milo of Croton. Milo basically, when he was a child, he was given a calf, and basically every day he carried the calf around with him all the time, and he did that for every day as the calf was getting larger until it was basically a cow. So his end goal was to try and lift a cow. Every day, as the cow grew, it got heavier and heavier and heavier, and basically resistance was added slowly over a long period of time until he could eventually lift a fully grown bull. I mean, this is just a very basic explanation of the principle. There's obviously much more complicated. It gets much more complicated than that because strength does not develop linearly. Like, if you keep adding resistance over a long period of time, eventually you're going to get to a level where just linear progression and just adding weight constantly every day does not work. The principle of linear progression underlies every form of training and everything that you do in the gym. It underlies pretty much every form of exercise and trying to improve yourself. This isn't to be confused with linear periodization, which is the reduction of volume and increase of intensity over time. That's linear periodization. That is not the same as linear progression. Progression is adding resistance, whatever form that resistance may take, adding difficulty to an exercise over time. And there's lots of ways you can do this. It's not just like, a lot of people get confused and think linear progression just means adding weight on the bar. There's a lot more things to it than that. It could be gradually increasing volume, increasing the number of reps you do, increasing the number of sets. It could be a reduction of rest times. It can also mean like changing of exercises. So like actually changing exercise itself is a form of like changing exercise from an easier exercise to a more difficult exercise is also a form of linear progression. Other ways you can do it is time under tension. So increasing the time under tension is also an increase. It's also a progression. Anything that makes the exercise harder is basically a form of progression. Different forms of progression might be more relevant to certain goals. So say for example, increased intensity might be the best form of linear progression for someone with the aim of trying to gain strength. I'm not saying that should be the exclusive method which they use to progress their training, but say someone else whose primary goal is hypertrophy might focus on increasing volume, decreasing rest time, or time under tension. But what I'm saying with this is not necessarily guys who are focused on strength should just increase weight, because that doesn't work. Like, you eventually get to a point where you can't add more weight to the bar, and other forms of progression, such as increasing volume, might be necessary to continue making progress. And same with the guys who are hypertrophy focused. Like, increasing weight is still increasing the progression of like weight on the bar as a progression method is still valid for bodybuilders, for example, regardless of what periodization model you use, whether that be like undulating periodization, linear periodization, conjugate periodization in the form of like Westside. The aim of all of these types of periodizations is to increase progression over time, to increase the difficulty of exercise over time, whether that be bodybuilding programs, powerlifting programs. In order to continue making adaptations to training needs to continually get more difficult. As if it doesn't, you're going to adapt to it, and there's not going to be a sufficient stimulus in order to continue making progress. However, what I would like to note with linear progression as well is it's important. Like, just because you're using linear progression doesn't mean you need to be maxing out all the time. Going back to the example of Milo, it's very important to like keep this principle in mind during all your training, and like while you're planning out your training, you should always be focusing on improving in some way. You might, it's not always possible to make improvements. Like, some sessions you can have a bad session and do badly. Like, strength is not linear like it is in the model of Milo. However, it's still important to like keep that as the focus. That should be the aim. It's not always possible to do better than last time, but long term, you should be looking at making improvements over time. And this does not necessarily mean just adding weight. Like, if you do 5 sets of 5 with a certain weight, but you do that with shorter rest periods, you've improved, you've got stronger. If you it's not just increased weight. If you increase the weight for the same reps over time, it's obvious you've got stronger. However, like if you decrease the rest periods, yeah, that's also a point I missed out earlier on was frequency. So you can also increase linear progression by increasing frequency over time. It's fairly limited. It's a fairly limited application. Like you can only increase frequency so much until recovery becomes an issue. But also on the same point, if you increase frequency over time, you've improved. It's still an improvement. So say you go from being able to complete 2 sessions a week to 3, which is 3 is probably the most you can really progress to. That's still a form of progression. Also, it's important to not over focus on 1 rep max. Like, yeah, you've increased your 1 rep max over time, but if you can complete like 3 sets of 3 with a weight 10 kilos more than you could last year, that's still an improvement. Like it's not, you don't have to be testing your 1 rep max all the time to like constantly assess your progression. You don't need to be testing your progression all the time. Just small little improvements in any of them progression factors still equals an improvement in performance. So over time, it all adds up. Tiny little progressions like that over time. Just like in the Milo example, like he carried the ball every day, but it increased a small amount of weight every day, and over the time period of that cow's growth, he was eventually able to lift it. So that's what we're focusing on with linear progression: is small improvements over time, and this should be factored into your training and whatever periodization you're using. I think that's all for today, guys. I think I've covered everything on that. If there's any questions, don't hesitate to ask. Cheers for watching. Please like and subscribe. Out.